Hey everyone, it's Alex and welcome to Altered Academy. Now in this video we're going to be discussing each of the starter decks available for Altered's Beyond the Gates first set release. Now what's amazing about these starter decks is that each of them really leans effectively into the individual kind of identities of the factions, giving you a really good kind of idea of how these factions play, where their strengths are, and where their identities lie within the Altered universe. They're also very fun and particularly well balanced, with the exception of one, which I think is a little stronger than the others. But what we're going to be talking about in this video is each of the starter decks to give you an idea of like how those archetypes shake out compared to other games, so you can kind of get a good indication of which deck might be best for you. And then of course, it's worth noting that I will be releasing individualized complete guides to each of these decks in future videos. So this is a new channel. If you're not subscribed yet, consider subscribing to keep up to date with those videos. But regardless, let's get started with an overview of each of the starter decks. First, we have Axiom, which is going to revolve around using permanents and landmarks to kind of create a slow but steady advantage in the course of the game. And then you have Bravos, which is similar to like a mono-red mid-range style deck for those that play other games, and it's essentially very aggressive, utilizing highly statted creatures and minions, with fleeting, which means that you kind of lose hand advantage over time because they kind of don't go into reserve and they get discarded instead. You have Lyra, which is all about utilizing RNG and dice rolls to take a risk towards gaining an advantage. Muna is all about utilizing boosts and the anchored statistics to kind of build an aggressive and powerful board state over time. You have Ordis, which is basically about zooing out with sheer numbers and then boosting those numbers to close in for the closing push. And then finally, Yzmir, a very traditional control style archetype, where essentially your ability to react and respond to your opponent is the decisive factor in winning the game. Now let's talk about the cards and some of the individual synergies. Let's get started with Bravos. Right off the top here, Bravos is going to have Kojo and Buddha as their core hero. This has a similar effect to the Ordis hero, which has a 1/1/1 every single turn at noon. This has a 2/2/2, which is double the power but half the time, which allows you to kind of synchronize your pushes and be more aggressive with Bravos to gain advantages on two expeditions at once. The 2/2/2 is extremely powerful and gives you a significant advantage each single time it's on the field. Now what's notable about this deck as well is you have very aggressive cards like the Bravos Tracer. This has impeccable stats, 4/3/4, and this is obviously the rare version. And you also have the core standard version here, which I'm having trouble clicking on. There we go. It's a 3/3/3 for 2, which is honestly impeccable stats. The issue here is it has fleeting, so most cards in Altered will go to the reserve after it sees play in the expeditions, which is almost like being able to play it a second time. And so this just immediately gets discarded and you lose the ability to play it out from reserve again. As a result, it is used as a very aggressive tactic to kind of push expeditions, but if you use them too early or you use them kind of haphazardly, you will lose your hand advantage and be basically in top deck mode rather quickly, which is not where you want to be as a Bravos player. It's also worth noting Bravos does a really good job of managing kind of boost through the reserve, so something like the Haven Trainee will come out a little weak, and you can see that it's a 3/1/1, not the best statistics, but when it comes out from the reserve, it suddenly gains 2 boosts to kind of go 5/3/3, which is a pretty damn strong line for 4 cost. You also have your Bouncer, which is a sabotage-based card, which removes cards from your opponent's reserves, kind of, we'll say rectifying some of your hand advantage. But one of the key combos you're often going for here is Sun Wukong, who essentially is able to come in and out of reserve without being discarded altogether. As the rare, it essentially loses its fleeting, which means you can play it over and over again, which is one of the best things you can do in this particular deck. And you also have the key combination of Atlas, who has Gigantic, which basically means that he's present in all of the the locations, the expeditions present in the game. And what you can do is you can buff him with something like Physical Training to then increase the power across both expeditions, despite only having 1 card on the field. Bravos represents a kind of an archetype that's very aggressive with a lot of boosts in order to win those expeditions very aggressively and close out the game early. That takes us to Yzmir. Now Yzmir is going to have Akisha and Taru, which at first glance does not seem that powerful. If you're new to Altered, you're thinking, Alex, after you activate this, if only you're the first player, so you only get to use it half the time, and then you just use it and wow, they get to go first. Is that really that good? Yes, it's actually amazing, because Altered, one of the key things that you slowly start to realize as you play it's very advantageous for you to kind of scout your opponent's plays in advance and then respond to them. Because, in most games, you often want to play kind of on curve. If you have 3 energy, put a 3 energy minion down or whatever, right? That's usually what you want to do. But in Altered, you're trying to win 2 separate locations. So it's often beneficial to use lower costed cards to attack both in some degree. So having a Kishantaru gives the opportunity to be responsive to what your opponent's doing to gain an advantage, which is exactly what this control archetype wants to do. A lot of key cards here, which I absolutely love here, include the Tooth Fairy, which can, for very inexpensive from hand, it'll sabotage your opponent's reserve, and again, that's that little bit of control. You also have Baba Yaga, which is a fantastic card, because hey, who does not like drawing cards in card games? A little bit of a weaker statted body, particularly on the non-rare, but Baba Yaga draws you a card, and you want that card advantage as someone who's playing control, because with your control, you need a hand size to make to offer answers to the questions that your opponent is asking. You also have Alice, who is a very vanilla statted card, but once again, relatively strong for this archetype. But very key here is if discarded from the reserve, Alice generates that after you kind of hero ability. So on turns where you do not go first and you wish to have that ability, you can discard Alice to create that effect, right? And, that is both present on the rare and on the standard card. One of the most exciting cards is going to be Kraken's Wrath, which, again, this is why the After You is so important. They play down their cards, and you're able to send 3 of them to reserve and essentially completely disrupt their play. It's also worth noting that at the end of a turn, an opponent can only have 2 cards in reserve, so effectively 1 is discarded because they simply can't keep it in the reserve overnight. Honestly, a lot of control elements here, like Banishing the Gate, which discards a target permanent or character. You also have Off You Go, which basically sends to reserve another character. So again, very counterspell-y and, dealing with your opponent's board state in creative and fun ways. And that takes us to the Ordis faction, one of my absolute favorites. I will say right off the top here that I do believe that the Ordis starter deck is a little bit stronger than the others. As a whole, they all feel relatively balanced. But if I was in a starter deck tournament and I had to pick one of these factions, I am 100% taking Ordis, because in my experience, it is a great deck with fantastic kind of start potential and early game kind of progress, with also incredible closing capabilities. This is a very strong starter deck, and it starts with Wingspan and Yzmir. I gotta get used to saying these names. But at noon, basically you create an Ordis Recruit 1/1/1 in your hero expedition. Now, what's notable about this is, much like the Bravos hero, this is a 1/1 that's available every turn. The Ordis hero is a 2/2/2 available every second turn. It gives you a constant pushing presence, which makes the early game a little easier, in particular if you're playing small creatures and minions out, in order to kind of put pressure on multiple locations. The key thing is you want to be very wide with Ordis, because you have multiple skills to take advantage of that, including what I believe to be one of the absolute key skills. Where is it? There it is, in Charge. Charge is one of the skills that you very likely are never going to want to use as mana, because it is a win condition for the Ordis deck. When you have multiple creatures and characters out on the field of play and you use Charge, it's often very difficult at 2 energy for your opponent to react to that board state, especially when you're using some of these amazing permanents that Ordis has, including the Ordis Carrier, which essentially adds an additional recruit at the start of each individual turn, but not the turn in which it's played. This gives you an opportunity of, just in and of itself, if you don't play anything else except the Ordis Carrier and obviously its additional minion with Charge, it's already 2/2/2 for 2 cost. What becomes amazing is when you play cards like Jeanne d'Arc, who is pretty interesting because it has like this delayed effect. You pay 5, you put 2/2 down, and then when Jeanne comes off the field of play, four recruits come out, because 2 in each expedition. That's crazy. And then when you couple that with Charge, it's a tremendous amount of power across the board. And when you get into the later game and you have something like 7 energy, you can actually combo Open the Gates, which adds 4 additional recruits based on where you want to play them, in addition to Charge. So you can see how with Charge, that statistics for 2 costs just skyrockets as more and more gets onto the field of play. And that's assuming that you're not even using this Bastion the Monolith here, which also adds kind of +1 counters to each individual character coming into the field of play. This deck is a zoo deck that has both a very strong early game and a very strong late game as well. Honestly, it's one of my absolute favorite, and with the mechanic, you can actually get those permanents out a little faster, those landmarks out faster from discarding it from the reserve, while also playing it out on the earlier turns as well. Ordis is absolutely fantastic, and if you're looking to get started with a very straightforward but powerful deck, this is the one that I would pick. As we move towards Axiom, a reminder, I will be doing a full deep dive with gameplay examples of each of these starter decks in upcoming videos. So right now my goal is to give you a quick overview, show you some of the highlights to help you make a selection on your journey. And that takes us to Sierra and Oddball. Now, the construct style of play for Axiom takes a little bit of getting used to. It's one of the trickier ones to play. I think there's one deck in Lyra that's a little trickier to play, but ultimately, the power output of Axiom is incredible, especially with its constructs. And Sierra and Oddball love constructs coming out, and when you play expensive permanents, because, well, you get free constructs. And then when you get free constructs, you're able to do magical things like buff up your little piggies, who have incredible stat lines once you have more landmarks out on the field. If you have 2 landmarks, which you're very likely to have in this type of deck, a 3 costed 5/5/5. That's insane, right? Like, that's incredible statistics. And while I don't want to jump all the way to the landmarks, which I think are the highlights of this deck, it is worth noting that you do have the Foundry mechanic, which helps you get those landmarks out early when discarded from the reserve. You do have the Overseer, which is fantastic because it'll reactivate the permanence abilities, right? Which is great, and I'll show you why. Because one of the absolute best cards that you could possibly get, to the point that even though it's 6 energy, you're gonna always keep it in your starting hand, is the Brass Bug Hive. This is going to create Brass Bugs once it is entering the field of play. It's gonna create a Brass Bug at the start of each individual noon turn. And then the great thing about it is that as the rare edition, every time a robot joins your expeditions, it gains a boost, which is incredible because you're working with a lot of robots here. And just the standard version is still, that's not the standard version. We gotta go the other way. Hey, where's the standard version? There it is. The ordering was a little funny there. But the standard version does not give the boost, but still, right? When it comes into the play, it does the Brass Bug Hive, and at each individual noon, it gives the Brass Bug Hive. So imagine that, that Bravos effect, but each and every turn. That's remarkable. And then when you get the Overseer, you can reproc that Brass Bug Hive and send it out again. A lot of versatility in these decks. It also has Keylon Burst, which is a very good spell for kind of creating a little bit of disruption. And it's also worth noting that if you're against Axiom players, it's important you have removal like this. You want to discard their permanents, which is disruptive for them as a whole. You have a lot of different things in Axiom. They're really good at maintaining hand advantage. They play very well into kind of drawing into their hand with the Colonic Generator, which is one of my favorite landmarks in the game. But not only that, you're often putting cards into your resupply, which is your reserve. And when you play from reserve, a lot of the cards do benefit from playing reserve, but not only that, they get benefited from being discarded from reserve. So the reprocessor allows you to make some magic happen and get that movement going, okay? Ultimately, the play pattern is a little more complex, and I wouldn't say combo-centric, but you're building these constructs to gain an advantage over time, and ultimately, it's worth it because the deck is a ton of fun to play. I really enjoy playing Lyra, but I will caution you, this one is tricky to pilot as a new player. So, Navanka and Blotch, it's all about RNG, right? But generally speaking, it's favorable RNG. You want to get anchored, right? You want to get boosted, but you definitely don't want to get sent to reserve. That's one of those things that these cards often don't want to have done, and you might take a card that you've been working on and boosting, and then just ship it to reserve and essentially put yourself at a disadvantage. That's like rolling snake eyes. It's a bit risky, but the key thing that makes this deck kind of harder for new players is that the stat lines are very unpredictable and wonky. For instance, you have something like Hathor, who has 3/3/0, right? It's good for 2 stats. However, I mean, the stats, you have no water, and so that can be difficult to manage as you play the game. You're going to see the Lyra Skull, who's exactly the same, 3/0/2. The statistics on these cards are a little all over the place, despite the fact that they do have powerful effects like Resupply and Esmeralda, and obviously Resupply from both the reserve and from hand in the rare edition. It's just that the statistics are wonky. They're all over the place. The combo-centric play of the deck is challenging, and the RNG rolls can be punishing. Although there are cards, obviously, like Asmodeus, who's just one of the key cards of this archetype, who just always wants to get rolled on, right? And that's very beneficial. And if you want to reduce the RNG kind of impact here, you do have the Ouroboros, which allows you to roll multiple dice and then discard the worst result. So you basically have to roll Snake Eyes to send something to your reserve. A very interesting archetype that I like a lot. However, it is challenging to pilot due to the fact that the statistics are kind of a little wonky, they're all over the place, and then while you're trying to get used to playing Altered, this might be one of the more challenging ones to pilot, especially when you consider the rather straightforward nature of Ordis, Bravos, and some of the others. And then that takes us to Muna. Now, Muna is really interesting in a sense that it's kind of like a slower version of a mid-range deck that uses anchored cards, which means that they do not move to reserve after the end of the turn, but rather stay in the field of play to maintain a board state to gain an advantage over your opponent. It utilizes a lot of boosting mechanics to make these anchored characters extremely strong and to kind of take your opponents by surprise by boosting them and, overpowering your opponent's positions. And Tisha and Nora do exactly that, because the card in and of itself is whatever character you play first gets an automatic boost. Now, that's good and bad. The reason why it could be bad is because, sometimes you're kind of picking and prodding with your first plays. You're playing inexpensive cards to make it so that your opponent has to read and react to what you're doing, and you might have an alternate play you want to do where you want to apply that boost there. So with this Muna hero, Tisha and Nara, you want to make sure that whatever card you're playing first, you want that boost to be on. Perhaps it's a card that's going to be anchored, or you're going to be applying an anchor to. So your turn style is very important to consider. So there's more macro elements to playing Muna than some of the other decks, but it's just worth considering the order at which you play your cards, because you're giving the first card you play an immediate boost, and then how you're going to anchor that or boost that further is up to you. And then some of the cards that really work to do that is going to be the Coniferal Cone Man, which is one of my favorite names in the game and a great piece of art as well. Comes into the field of play anchored. This is the rare 4/4 version. The standard version is a 5/5 3/3/3/3. And the nice thing about these cards is that they gain anchored, and as you boost them, right, they stick on the field of play. And if you play this card first on your turn, it becomes a 4/4/4 that remains there for 2 turns unless removed. A very powerful effect. You also have the Daughter of Yggdrasil? Man, I don't know how to say that word. But anyways, it's interesting because it has an incredible body, a massive stat line, a 5/5/3 incredible, but your opponent draws a card. Okay, so you're giving away card advantage for the straight up statistical ability. That's pretty interesting, and your ability to manage that, or maybe have this get anchored down to keep those stats while not repeatedly feeding into your opponent's card draw, is going to be very important. Parvati, a very interesting card as well, where you basically play it from hand and give a target card anchored. Again, if you've boosted that card, it remains as well. And when you play it from reserve, it also gets anchored, and that of course is the ability of the rare version. Muna also has some elements of control, as in something like a Beauty Sleep, where essentially you negate the effect of a particular character for that turn. They fall asleep, their statistics are not applied to the board state, but they're anchored to a degree, whereas your opponent does not have them move to reserve. They remain on the field of play for next turn, but if played on the last turn of the game, heck, that's amazing. So if they play an absolutely massive creature down, right, and they just play one hoping to win the game and you just put it to sleep, well, hey, that's pretty good. Unless, of course, they have Tough, which increases the spell cost, but still then, at best, you're still paying 3 to have this effect done and negate an entire big play. And this is why in Altered, it can be very valuable to, instead of playing massive cards all the time, play a lot of smaller cards, right? And Beauty Sleep is kind of a testament towards that. And from the Bravos, you do have Physical Training, which really benefits the anchored cards, because this effect will remain there and be present despite the fact that the kind of day will shift and the anchored card will remain with its boost. It does lose its boost when it goes into reserve, however. There is a season tag which keeps its boosts, but that is not present in the starter deck. Overall, I really do like Muna. It's all about boosting cards, kind of keeping those boosts active, keeping them anchored. And one more card I want to talk about here is this Sneezer Shroom, which, you play it out as the first card. It becomes a 2/2/2. It gets anchored, and it's going to be there for the next turn as well. And then the rare version of it, at noon, it gains an additional boost. So if the longer you keep it anchored, it actually just ticks up in power, which is cool with cards like Parvati and others that can anchor cards very specifically to the board state. Anyways, guys, I hope this video was helpful to you. I did my absolute best to give you a quick and brief breakdown of all the starter decks. there's a lot of options here. I mean, you might want to get all of them, and that's fine. And you might want to just pick up one or two based on the kind of playstyle that you're interested in. I will say that if you're new to the channel, consider hitting the subscribe button. I will be keeping you up to date with as much Altered content as I can possibly produce. And we'll be doing full beginner's guides on each of these decks with gameplay examples. So I hope this video was helpful to you, and we'll see you on that next one. Take care.